Dr Hope Christie. She's from the University of Edinburgh Centre for Research on Children and Families. She's going to talk a bit about her research in relation to trauma, and in particular, how do dads experience trauma. After Hope has done her talk, there'll then be the chance to ask Hope some questions. As Hope's talking, if any thoughts come to mind, if any questions come to mind, please feel free to use the chat function. I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll answer any questions or open up any conversation around those questions once Hope's finished her talk. So without any further ado, I shall hand you over to Dr. Hope Christie. It's all yours, Hope.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's really a great introduction, and I'm really glad you said you keep an eye on the chat, because I always find it difficult to do both. So thank you for doing that. Okay, so as Chris said, my name is Hope. My expertise and my doctorate, I'm going to share my screen so hopefully you all can see this, is it? Please, I can see some faces, so if you can see this, then hopefully that's good. Yeah, so my doctorate was working with parents, both mothers and fathers, that had experienced a traumatic event and had developed post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as a result of that event. I was really interested in trying to hear more from the parents' perspective around how they felt their trauma had affected them and subsequently impacted on their parenting. What I find, or what we found really at the research, is that when a parent experiences mental health difficulties, whether it be PTSD, depression, anxiety, or otherwise, the research seems to really focus on how that kind of intergenerational transmission or ripple effect between the parent and the child. So how is, excuse me, the parent's mental health affecting the child's social, psychological, emotional development? And while that is really important, and obviously we want to make sure that the children are developing as best they possibly can do, if you're looking at a ripple effect, my argument would be that you also need to look at the stone that's kind of making that ripple. So you really need to look at the parent and their mental health and helping them kind of function the best they possibly can, being the best that are feeling the best that they can to help their child. So that was really the motivation for my doctorate research, and so this is a part of it. So I'll take you through some stuff. As Chris said, please feel free to drop questions in the chat, and I'll try, and either if I can't see them, then I'll pick them up after. Okay, grand. So I'm sure you're all fine well aware of what post-traumatic stress disorder is, or PTSD, but I think just quickly, I think it's helpful just to run through that post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a psychological disorder that may develop after experiencing a traumatic event. And I say may because it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you can go through a traumatic event, you can experience some traumatic stress symptoms, but actually over time those symptoms kind of dissipate and you can carry on as you were before. For others, unfortunately, some of those symptoms get worse, they exacerbate, they actually then end up hindering on your everyday function, and that is when you can be diagnosed with PTSD. So when I'm talking about these post-traumatic stress symptoms, I'm really talking about these four main symptom clusters. So you obviously have the stressor that happens. You then can experience these four symptom clusters. So re-experiencing, so feeling like you're reliving the trauma all over again, as if it's happening for the first time. People usually describe these as kind of flashing images that happen. Sometimes it happens on a bit of a subconscious level, so you're not really sure what triggers it. But for example, if you were maybe in a really severe car accident and it was raining that day, you might be leaving the house or leaving your work and it starts to rain, and you might start getting flashbacks of the trauma just because your brain's making the connection there. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in a car to have that memory triggered. There's also hypervigilance or hyper-awareness, so being constantly aware of your environment at all times, and also feeling very unsafe in your environment at all times. So just thinking that the world's a really unsafe place, and you know, the danger's kind of lurking around every corner, and a perfect example of that, and I'm sure we'll get into it as we go on, but one of my dads in the study that took part said that when he was ever out driving, he used to leave like a car's width in front of him. So if something would happen at any time while he was driving, he could spin the car around and drive the other way. And that was kind of he was always thinking about that. And that was always kind of his default position when he was out. So there was never a time where he felt safe. And he always had to keep that space in front of him when he was driving, so that if something happened, if anything happened, he could get away from danger. So that's kind of hypervigilance, hyper-awareness symptom. There's also avoidance, which is exactly as it says in the tin. You're actively avoiding any reminders or memories of the trauma, so you try not to think about it. As I say, if we stick with the car accident example, you maybe would avoid the site of the accident if you were to get back in a car, or maybe a more extreme end, you might avoid getting back in a car altogether if it's too distressing for you. And the last one is negative alterations to cognition or mood, which essentially is just a way of saying that you've changed kind of your perception of the world and of the way you look at yourself. So beforehand, you might have thought only bad things happen to bad people, but then you might change after your trauma and think, well, maybe I'm a bad person now because a bad thing has happened to me. Or you've got really no trust in anyone, and everyone's out to hurt you, and the world, as I say, is an unsafe place. So taken together, these symptom clusters do make up post-traumatic stress disorder. And as you know, even as I'm describing them, you can see how experiencing these on a daily basis could get really hindering for someone to try and carry on their day-to-day life. Excuse me. So what we know about PTSD is that, trauma is a common event that happens. So about approximately 90% of the population will experience a potentially traumatic event in their lifetime. So quite a substantial number. And of that 90%, about 7.8% will go on to develop PTSD. If I think about these numbers, sorry, I'm being very Edinburgh centric because that's where I'm from. But if we think about these percentages in terms of the Edinburgh population, so approximately there's 548,000 people that live in Edinburgh at the moment. So about 90% of them, 493,000, and then 7.8% of them is 34. So 34,524 people. So actually quite a considerable amount when you break those percentages down. So depending on whether you're a Hibs or a Heart fan, that 34,500 is actually enough to fill Tynecastle or Easter Stadium 1.5 times over. So actually quite a lot of people that will go on to develop PTSD after experiencing a traumatic event. Excuse me. So traumatic events are common. They happen globally, and the World Mental Health Survey has found that actually they're on the rise, and that there's actually quite a number of lifetime episodes of PTSD that are experienced per 100 people. And PTSD is also associated with a lot of additional consequences. So it can be comorbid with other disorders. So quite commonly we see people with PTSD also have comorbid depression or anxiety. So increased risk of suicidal ideation, poorer physical health quality, and a lot of negative impacts on social and family functioning. So it is a really disturbing and debilitating disorder, and can have really substantial impacts on that person's life after they've had their diagnosis or they've experienced their trauma. So these are all things that happen to adults and to children when they've experienced a traumatic event and go on to develop PTSD. But what I was really interested in, jumping ahead of myself, in terms of the sex differences of PTSD, we do know that across the whole population, there's a 7.8%, as I said. Women actually are more likely to develop PTSD than men. So women are more likely 10 to 12%, and men approximately 5 to 6. If men and women experience the same type of trauma, there's actually no evidence to suggest that one sex will develop PTSD over the other. But what is really interesting is that in terms of some traumas that are experienced by both sexes, so for example, being very seriously physically attacked, women actually are 15 times more likely for that specific type of trauma to develop PTSD over men. So it's just that men perhaps don't find that as distressing, or maybe kind of process it differently. And I think that really highlights the individual differences in trauma work that keeps myself and other colleagues in a lot of business for researching this, because my old supervisor used to say, you know, if we're sitting in a room together and the roof was to come down on us both right now, we would both experience the exact same thing, but we're both going to remember it differently and we're going to process it differently. And I think it's important to remember those kind of individual differences that go through. So similarly, I think it's important that just because I'm talking about the experiences that happened with my dads in terms of what they're reporting in this study doesn't necessarily mean that it would be the same for other fathers out there. So I've talked a little bit about PTSD in general. So what about PTSD in parents? Now, there are a few large population cohort studies found from American samples that actually the number of adults that are living with a lifetime diagnosis of PTSD, about 73% of them also have at least one biological child in their care. So actually quite a lot of adults that currently have PTSD also have children to take care of. So if you think about all the symptoms that I was describing to you before and the behaviour changes and the impairments that can happen, actually then having to look after a child as well on top of that could be quite demanding and quite challenging. And my colleagues and I conducted a systematic review a few years ago, so just a big review of the literature around parent PTSD, and very briefly summarised what we found was that parents with PTSD had poorer parenting satisfaction compared to parents without. They reported a poorer quality of relationship with their child. They reported greater parenting stress and increased use in negative parenting practices. And what I mean by that is just an increased use in kind of more physical, maybe aggressive practices like yelling or hitting. So those were parents with PTSD compared to parents without. So we are seeing that actually parents with PTSD do find it very challenging to parent, and they're obviously finding it a difficult relationship with their child and not as satisfied with their parenting. I appreciate that's quite difficult on a day-to-day basis anyway. But the review also highlighted a lot of gaps in our knowledge. So one thing that I don't think is specific just to trauma research, but there's a lack of father representation. So we found that really only specific samples, for example, military trauma was where most of the dads were researched. And military trauma is a very specific type of trauma, and there's a lot of other layers to that. So if dads come back from deployment, there's obviously the reintegration into the family that can be quite challenging, sometimes kind of re-establishing his role as a dad and as a parent in the family when they've been functioning without him. As well as other adjustments. So there are a lot of layers to peel back with military trauma, but that's where most of the dad representation is. I think this speaks to a larger issue. So a lot of the time there's these homogeneous samples or just a focus on one specific type of trauma, which in itself is helpful to know. But if we're looking at parenting difficulties or challenges as a result of trauma exposure and PTSD, it would be good to have a varied sample so we can see if there's any difficulties that cut across different trauma types. So for example, what I mean by that is what we find with military veterans, for example, is that they're very short fuse, and use quite aggressive parenting practices. Similarly, you can find similar findings with domestic violence trauma. But it would be good to know if those things happened across different trauma types as opposed to just those two specific. So that would be also one thing that we found in our research, that there's a gap there. And also a reliance on kind of parent self-report or questionnaires. So it's, I think anyone on the call or anyone listening to the presentation who is a parent, I'm sure you would be very quick if I said, what do you do well as a parent? And you'd be very quick to tell me things that you don't do that well, or like things that you could do better. But parents aren't always the most forthcoming on being kinder to themselves or where they've done well. And I think sometimes when you ask parents to report on their parenting, you can kind of get a bit of a bias result, and especially more so if the parent is also experiencing mental health difficulties. So it's important to try and do other methods such as observational work, for example, which you can watch the parent interact with their child in a kind of more naturalistic setting. So those were some of the gaps that we found. So that was my review. In terms of the wider literature, I've covered some of this a wee bit already. So what we found with parents with military, or specifically really dads with military trauma, again, they're reporting poorer parenting satisfaction and poor communication with their child. So either about their own mental health or otherwise. So what the research suggests there is that dads are really unwilling to either discuss that they're experiencing any difficulties or tell their child that they've got PTSD. They don't want to lose their authority as a parent. They don't want to come across as vulnerable, and they are worried that their child might tell other people. So those are some of the barriers to parent-child communication. And birth trauma, which I've seen is quite relevant in the media just now. Actually, I'm sure everybody's seen Chris talking on the news a couple of last week about father's mental health and birth trauma. So that both mums and dads do report a poorer parent-baby bond there, lower parenting satisfaction and increased parent stress. And mixed trauma, so if we're looking at a broad brush of a variety of traumas, both mums and dads report the use of more controlling behaviours, poorer communication and poorer attachment or relationship with their child. So again, really all this is telling us is that actually parents that have PTSD are reporting a number of challenges when parenting their child. And it's really important to dig a bit deeper into that, learn a bit more about it, and then see how we can effectively support families after. So that brings me to what my research is focusing on. So I was really interested, my project was a qualitative study, so really hearing from the parent's perspective. So finding out a little bit more about, from the parent themselves, how they felt their trauma experience and PTSD had really affected them, had affected their parenting, and how they had affected their family dynamic. We looked at a variety of trauma experiences. So we had 30 parents in total. We had 16 mums and 14 dads, which we were actually really pleased about because it's really difficult to try and get dads in for research like this. So it was really great to have that representation. And when I say, with a variety of traumas, this is the kind of things that we're talking about here. So you'll see this table is the focal and experience. So just the way the interview worked, we totally appreciated that it might not be the only trauma that the parent had ever experienced, but we were asking them to talk about the one that was kind of still the most distressing to them. So you can see out of the 30 here, 6 parents did talk about in the interview a serious accident, although 13 had experienced it. And I mean, you can read, so I'll not go through the table in much great detail, but we did have 8 dads. Military trauma was experienced by men only, so 8 dads did experience military trauma, although we did have 9 that had experienced it overall, but 8 had said that it was the most distressing thing for them. And we do have that other traumas and included incidents, workplace bullying and other examples. Okay, so just a wee bit of information about the sample. So all participants had experienced at least one traumatic event and had been diagnosed with PTSD. It's worth noting as well that all participants had received formal treatment or some form of formal treatment for their PTSD. So they had undergone that and either were right at the tail end of their treatment or had completed their treatment. And that ranged from kind of cognitive behavioural therapy, EMDR. Some of them were on medication. Some of them had gone for counselling, and some of them were still, as I say, in the throes of that. Parents' average age was about 52. They had across the sample, they ranged between having between 1 and 5 children. Some of the children were quite a bit older, so that median age was 23. But 57% still had at least one child living at home. So just before I get on to the findings from the interviews, I just want to touch on the The interview was kind of danced that fine line between almost like a therapy session. So we started by talking about what their life was like before the trauma had happened. I asked them what kind of person they were, what they enjoyed doing, happy memories they had with their family, that kind of thing. We then kind of dropped down and talked about the trauma in as much or as little detail as they wanted. They didn't have to go into a massive amount of detail because obviously I had it on the form what had happened, and they were free to tell me as much or as little as they wanted. And then we kind of we talked a little bit about how that had affected their parenting and their family, and then we kind of came back up to finish on talking about what life was like now, and how their parenting had been at that present day. So that was kind of the way that we structured it. And we also talked a little bit about recovery, coping and support. So the first thing that actually all parents did talk about was these noticeable changes in their mental health and their behaviour. So all parents, mothers and fathers, talked about the stark difference between before and after the trauma. Fathers specifically discussed difficulties with their irritability and aggression. So they said that this kind of expressed itself physically quite a lot of the time. So all dads that I interviewed did make the very clear point to me that they had never hit their children at any point. A couple of them, while not proud of it, did openly admit to hurting their partner. But all of them said that they had never touched their child. But they also, quite a lot of them did openly admit to breaking inanimate objects. So a couple of dads talked about punching through a wall or smashing furniture or doing something else before leaving the house. So that was quite specific to dads in terms of talking about the changes that they'd noticed in themselves after the trauma. Dads and mums talked about hyper awareness of surroundings. So that dad I was telling you about before, about leaving that big gap when he was driving. So they were very aware of their surroundings and felt very unsafe generally in their environment as well. That was quite a common thing to be discussed. And actually here's some quotes from dads just talking about excuse me, the changes that they'd experienced. So the first quote here says that I used to be quite an optimist. I was pretty happy and pretty content with things on the whole, but not now, not at all. I was quite a keen cyclist, enjoyed traveling. I was fairly outgoing, had a large circle of friends, and now I can say that I don't have any friends at all. I'm really withdrawn, particularly from my social side of things. Another dad said, he was talking about the perpetrator, that this dad had experienced some abuse in his childhood. So he was talking about the perpetrator here, saying that I wanted to kill him all the time. I had a rage and needed to kill him. I just wanted to kill him, and it was eating me up inside. That's all I ever thought about, was just wanting to kill him. I was confused, I was moody and angry, and it filled me up for years, just hatred and anger. And the last quote I've got here, dad says, yeah, I used to have, still do have really bad road rage, but I'm talking to the point where I would chase people down, drag them out of their car and educate them. I was very, very violent and very angry. People used to give me a wide berth because all they thought I was bonkers. So these are dads just talking about the changes there that they had noticed from before to after, and obviously quite a couple of those are expressing more kind of physical aggression. And actually one of the quotes there kind of leads me on to this quite nicely. So dads also talked about withdrawing from their social relationships quite a lot, which again, it isn't uncommon with PTSD. So dads talked about an unwillingness to be social, even if it was something that they previously enjoyed. So that quote before talking about really enjoying cycling, but not doing that anymore. Also any social clubs or anything that parents used to go to, that was off the table now, and they didn't go to anything. At the more extreme end, I did find a couple of parents said that they actually never really wanted to leave their house ever. And most expressed, I want to be left alone. So fathers also really didn't want to be seen as vulnerable to anyone around them. So the easiest thing for them to do was just to withdraw completely. And again, just a couple of quotes here to sum that up. So one dad here saying that I was classed as antisocial because I didn't want to talk to people or go out with people where it was noisy and loud. So you lose your circle of friends because you're not that person you were. You can't tell them why. So they all walk away, and then you become really lonely. Another dad saying that I wouldn't go out, I wouldn't socialise, I cut myself off from people and I avoided things. I didn't want to be seen as vulnerable, which is what I felt I was. And I didn't want the neighbours to see me. So again, just kind of really solidifying that didn't really want to be around people anymore. And the easiest thing to do was to cut yourself off from things. So that was parents discussing their changes that they've noticed in themselves, and obviously understandable that these changes would then feed into their parenting. So withdrawal didn't just really happen from the social side of things, but also from children and family. So dads were, and I do really want to emphasize that it wasn't a negative or malicious is maybe too strong a word, but it didn't have any negative intent. This was more I want to protect my children because I know I'm not in my best space right now, so I'm just going to remove myself. So fathers really noted that they could feel themselves becoming irritated and angered by their children's behaviour. So they just decided to remove themselves from that environment in order to prevent any outbursts. So as I say, it wasn't a nasty or a negative thing. It was more they could feel it building up. One dad was talking about his kid had like this really noisy toy that made like this really loud squealing noise. And his kid was so delighted with it that like the kid was also laughing and squealing. And he said that like, even though his child was happy, he could just feel himself getting more and more angry about it. So he just left the room and would go and sit upstairs on his own. But not because he didn't want to be around his child, but more because he knew that an outburst was coming and he didn't want to expose his child to that. So again, this behaviour wasn't linked to a specific trauma type, so it was across the different traumas that dads had experienced, that this is how they chose to deal with that. Dads also talked about being very overprotective. So this is kind of more rooted in that kind of fear of, or just being very aware of their environment all the time and very conscious that they didn't feel safe. And if they didn't feel safe, they were worried that their children weren't safe. And therefore, it was just this very overprotective parenting. So this is just talking a little bit about dad's anger. So you've got a couple of quotes here. So one dad was saying, like, I'd smashed the house up. I smashed the house and the house was smashed to pieces. I was yelling in the house and my daughter couldn't understand why. I did strangle my wife and nearly killed her. It was hard for the family and I felt guilty. It's not nice having flashbacks or panic attacks in front of your daughter. She didn't know what was wrong with me and it was hard. It was hard for me. I want to say that I never laid a finger on my daughter, but my wife, I did strangle her and hurt her and she put up a lot from me. Another dad saying that I never raised a hand in my life. I've never smacked my children, but I have yelled at them. What I would say would be worse than what I thought I would do. I would put my hands through walls or smash the door, and the children used to be petrified. As soon as I calmed down, I would apologise and say, I'm not being malicious, I'm not being mean to you, it's just the stuff that came out my mouth. So again, it's just talking about dad's that kind of that anger seeping out. Another quote from my dad saying that I didn't want him to become harmed in any way. So this is more talking about this overprotective side. So this dad's talking about his son, saying that I actually wouldn't take him to ice hockey or any other sports that he did before. I just wouldn't go with him because it was just sheer anxiety. I was so concerned for my child's safety. I'd already had one accident, so that was the dad's trauma. I'd already had one accident, and that was the only time I'd had an accident, and I certainly didn't want to have another one, and he also didn't want his child to experience anything like that. So that's that more overprotective side. Another quote from a dad, again, it's more about feeling unsafe in the environment. So this dad's talking about, like, there were times where I would go out late at night, maybe about midnight, and just patrol around where I lived. I felt like I needed to do this. It would keep everyone, his family, safe. The amount of burglars that I caught was unbelievable, but what I would do is go around with a big combat knife, which got me into quite a lot of trouble with the police. So again, it's more just dads trying to work through their trauma symptoms and trying to do what they can to either make themselves feel safe or make themselves feel more in control. And obviously that kind of fed into family life as well. Another thing that actually, again, was quite unanimous with parents was difficulties with communicating with their child. But it really did seem to come out more strongly with dads discussing their trauma and mental health with their children. So dads talked quite a lot about the fact that they really expected a lot of openness and honesty from their children. They really wanted their children to come to them if they had any problems whatsoever. If the child had been in trouble, they wanted their child to be able to come and tell the truth. But there was a little bit of contrast there, because they weren't being fully open and honest with their child. Parents felt like their child didn't really need to know any detail of what happened, which you can understand. And they, especially dads, felt that their role as a parent was not to traumatize their child by sharing this information. So when I asked them about the fact that they weren't telling their child that they had PTSD, or they weren't telling their child that they were going through this really difficult mental period, and dads seemed to say like, but I don't want to traumatize them with information about my trauma. And I had said, I understand that, but more talking about their PTSD, your PTSD, and not the trauma. There wasn't really, it was a difficult disconnect for them. So it was kind of like, oh, if I'm going to explain why I've got PTSD, then I need to explain the trauma. We've got a couple of quotes here. So a dad had said, ever since then, I've never really spoken about the accident with boys, because again, I feel like it was inflicting all the sadness on them, because it was a huge part of their lives, and I just kept it to myself, really. Another dad was saying, because it was a nasty event and I really didn't want them to be bothered with it, I really didn't want them knowing that, because when I was with them, the children, it was nice and it was different, and I had absolutely nothing to do with the trauma. So that can stay where it is, and my kids don't have to be involved in any of it. So again, it's more just about that protection of, I don't really want you to know this. I don't want to make you sad. Or I don't want to traumatize you with this information. So I just would rather just keep everything to myself. Parents also talked about just feeling that they really just weren't very effective as a parent, that they were really doing a bad job as a parent. As part of the interviews, I did ask parents what they felt that they had did or done well as a parent, and for the majority of them, mums and dads, this was actually a really difficult question, and quite a few actually couldn't answer it. Most were really quick to identify examples, the evidence that they were a poor parent, stating that they could sooner name a longer list of things that they'd done wrong. And a lot of them were really worried that their PTSD and their behaviours may have had adverse effects on their children. And this was actually a really sad part of the interview for me, just because in the preceding part of the interview, the part of the interview before, some parents had listed like these really imaginative, like engaging things that they'd done with their kids, but because it wasn't what, quote, normal parents do, they said that it just was lesser. So I had one dad talk about the fact that he really struggled to go to the cinema or any sort of big shopping mall with his kids. He couldn't do it. There was too many people. He didn't feel safe in that environment. The thought of being locked in a room was terrifying, and it was too loud and he didn't like it. But like, he was like, so, as an alternative, we had like movie nights. So when that film came out on DVD or for streaming or whatever, we would get it. We would get duvets down and pillows and make like a big fort in the living room, and we'd get popcorn and like snacks, and we'd sit and watch it together as a family. And like, that sounded great. But because it wasn't what a normal dad would do, he just thought it was lesser. And it was the same, another dad, like, again, really struggled to go to shopping centres with his teenage daughters. And so he said, I still wanted to engage with them. So I took them out on nature walks. We'd go like up into the hills and walk, and we would pick something to learn about that day. If it was flowers or trees or birds or whatever, we would look for them and we'd learn about them. And again, like, I was saying that to him, that sounds great. But he said because, he couldn't take them to a shopping centre, it was a sign of being a poor parent. So yeah, I mean, here's the quote that I was just telling you about, that a dad saying, you know, normal children who have normal parents are able to go out, they go to the park or for walks or to the movies. I can't do a simple thing like going to the movies. I can't tolerate crowds. I can't be in a locked room. I just feel guilty because as a parent, I should be able to do all these normal things that normal parents do, but I can't because of my condition. And from that perspective, I feel as though I'm a bad parent. Another dad saying, during the time of my PTSD, when my son was younger, I always feel quite sure that it affected him. There was a brief period of time where he went through a bit of drinking, which I know was wrong. So again, it's just that parent thinking about the fact that they're worried about how the effect of their PTSD might have on their child. And so lastly, we talked about, recovery, coping and support. So while treatment was acknowledged to have helped parents, they fully said that it didn't return them to the way they were pre-trauma. It allowed them to function a lot better, and they were able to do things that they weren't able to do before, but they said they just weren't the same person. Dads also really acknowledged that children were really important in that recovery process. Even if they didn't show it all the time, the fact that their children were there, I think one of their dads described their son like an anchor that was kind of just keeping him safe and holding him steady. So, and a lot of parents admitted that if their child wasn't there or they didn't have their child to get up for, that actually a lot of them might not have been around for the interview. So children were a really important part of that recovery process. Parents also were still experiencing parenting difficulties during the time of the interview. So even if they were referring to themselves as an individual, as a person in a better space, there was almost a bit of a disconnect with their parenting, like their parenting almost hadn't caught up. So, you know, they were still experiencing these parenting difficulties, or their parenting was still poor and their child would never recover, even if they themselves were feeling in a bit of a better space as a person. So that was quite difficult for them to talk about. So sorry, I feel like I've just blasted through that, but the key points to take away from those interviews was, in line with previous research, you know, we have found PTSD can really impact on parenting behaviours and quite a number of facets as well. Parents also report, obviously, both mums and dads, that there was changes to themselves as a person, and they really were no longer the same person as they were before, which in itself is a really difficult thing to come to terms with and to process. All parents were able to note and point out, and this was probably due to the therapy or treatment that they'd had, they were able to retrospectively look back at specific symptoms that were linked to particular parenting behaviours. So, for example, being very hyper aware or hyper vigilant meant that they were much more overprotective over their child and their child's well-being. Although most difficulties and challenges were reported across the board by parents, there were some differences. So dads specifically really did, it was a lot more common for them to talk about just being really persistently angry and irritable. That often resulted in physical aggression, and dads as well talked more about withdrawing from their children and other family as a way to kind of cope. So they would shut down those family relationships. And again, I really must emphasize that it wasn't with negative intent. It was really just purely done to protect the child or the family, or it was, in their eyes, that's what they were protecting. And again, it speaks to that negative change in mood where, you know, dads really just didn't think they were a good person to be around. So they didn't really even want to be in their own company. So they didn't think their children would want to be around them either. And just as a flip, I should mention mums were almost the opposite in that they just were around their children all the time. So didn't leave them with babysitters or nursery staff or school staff. They just didn't. I remember one mum saying that she would drop her kids off at school and sit in the car for the whole day in the car park while they were at school. In the school car park, she would sit there all day. She would not move from the school, and then she would just be there just in case anything happened. So it was just that opposing behaviours was quite interesting. Some implications of the research. So clinically, I don't know if this has changed now, and I am speaking from a couple of years ago when this research was conducted, and I know a couple of clinical colleagues that said that they didn't do this, so it might have changed now. So I'm happy to speak under correction if that's the case. But it might be worth clinicians taking a family history or household makeup when they take on new clients for trauma or PTSD treatment, just because I think it can be quite individualistic treatment for PTSD, in the sense that, you know, you're really dealing with a parent in that therapeutic context, but that doesn't really help the parent much when they've got to go back home and kind of still deal with all the daily challenges of being a mum or a dad. So I think it's worth considering the family makeup and other challenges that might be presenting themselves in that therapeutic context. Treatment was varied for a lot of parents, but outcomes were generally positive, but definitely more help and support was needed for parenting. And then generally, implications wise, communication support I think is a big thing. And you know, as I was saying in the gaps in the literature before, it seems that similar parenting challenges were reported across a variety of traumas. And generally, mums and dads were experiencing very similar difficulties with just a few individual variations. But as always, more work is still greatly needed. So in terms of limitations, I'm fully aware that there's still things that could be made better with that research. So it was still cross-sectional. So we're only taking that from one particular time point with parents. And I'm sure any parents that are listening, you know, your parenting changes on a day-to-day basis, depending on how you're feeling, how your child's feeling, how their behaviour is that morning when they're getting up and getting ready. So I think it would be trying to get maybe multiple time points would be helpful to just get a bit better, more detailed picture of parenting. While it was really in depth, the information that I got, still parent report. So I feel like the parents were very honest with me, but I think again, it would be good to maybe get perspectives from other people in the house as well. And it was not for want of a better phrase, not at the height of their PTSD symptoms. So most parents had been at least 3, but sometimes 5+ years since their trauma had happened, and all of them had gone through therapy by that point. So admittedly, themselves were in a better place than they were before. So as always, more research is needed. I think dads' voices really do need to be heard. I mean, they did make up a good portion of this sample, but I think it's good to try and get more dads into this kind of work. As I mentioned a bit earlier on, observational work I think would also be really helpful, because you're removing the parent report element out of that, and you could just watch them, parent and child, interact together in a more naturalistic environment. Insight from other household members I think would also be helpful across multiple time points, and possibly maybe considering designing some interim support with what we know so far might be helpful. So I know that colleagues and I, for a while, I was toying around with the idea of doing some sort of children's book that was just pictures to maybe help that communication barrier between parent and child. So perhaps that's worthwhile pursuing with what we've got so far. So I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the other people that were involved in this. It wasn't just a solo venture. So my PhD supervisors, Sarah and Catherine, were huge in helping me with this. And also the team at Cardiff, John, Neil and Jack were helpful in kind of sourcing the parents for this, and Rosie helped with some of the analysis. So a really great team. But yeah, thank you very much everybody for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions or just have a wider discussion with you all now. Thank you.